They think he's lonely. They see the empty chair, one mug, lights off by 9, and they assume he's been left behind. But what they don't see is the soft smile when he hears the kettle whistle, the calm in his chest when silence wraps around the room, the quiet power of a man who no longer performs for anyone. Because living alone isn't emptiness, it's clarity. And what most people call loneliness, he calls coming home. The joy of not explaining himself. There's a deep kind of exhaustion that builds up over the years, not from work, not from age, but from always having to explain who you are to people who don't really want to understand. He remembers how it felt, being asked, "Why are you so quiet?" Being told, "Lighten up." Having to reassure someone that silence didn't mean something was wrong, it wore him down. Not just the words, but the subtle message beneath them. You, as you are, make people uncomfortable. So he tried. He softened his tone. He smiled more. He filled the silences that he didn't need to fill. And slowly, without noticing, he began to vanish from his own, live replaced by a version of himself that was easier for others to digest. But now, he lives alone. And the silence isn't something he has to defend. It's something he's reclaimed. No one asks what's wrong just because he's quiet. No one expects a performance when he's thinking. His stillness doesn't need subtitles. He can feel without explaining, rest without guilt, just exist without translation. And that, he's learned, is a kind of peace he never knew he was missing. The joy of reclaiming his mornings. Once, mornings meant rushing, alarms, small talk before coffee, negotiating moods before he'd even opened both eyes. There was always some shared rhythm to fall into, some joint schedule to respect. His own pace was always secondary. But these days, the sun is his alarm. The birds are his company. The pace is slow, intentional, almost sacred. He moves through his morning like a quiet ceremony. He makes his tea with both hands. He breathes in the warmth and lets it settle in his chest. Sometimes he plays soft music. Other times, he just listens to his thoughts, to the wind outside, to nothing at all. There's no pressure to start the day together. He starts it with himself, and that's more than enough. He never realized how much of his life was spent adjusting to someone else's energy until he had space to feel his own. And now, he guards those early hours, not with walls but with quiet rituals that remind him, you belong to you. The joy of small rituals. He doesn't live for big moments anymore. He lives for the small ones, the quiet ones. He lights a candle at dusk not to impress, not to prepare but because the flicker calms his breath. He sweeps the porch every Sunday, not because anyone will see it, but because it grounds him. It reminds him that this is his home, and he takes care of it. He folds his clothes slowly, reads by the window as the light fades, tends to his plants like they're old friends. These aren't habits, they're anchors. Each small act says something silently powerful. You matter, even when no one's watching, especially then. And the beauty of these rituals is that they don't need to be shared to be meaningful. They're not for social media, they're not for validation, they're for him. Because sometimes, the most profound joy doesn't come from being seen, but from seeing yourself clearly, gently, and finally, without judgment. The joy of emotional self-sufficiency. He used to believe love meant emotional labor, that if someone was hurting, he had to fix it. If someone was silent, he had to guess why. If someone was upset, he had to make it about him. What did I do? What should I say? His emotions took a back seat to everyone else's storms. He became a barometer for moods that weren't his, a translator for feelings he didn't cause. And eventually, a man so far removed from his emotional truth, he forgot what he felt altogether. But now, he sits with whatever arises, without trying to negotiate with it. When sadness comes, he lets it in. When joy comes, he doesn't clutch it. When a wave of loneliness rolls through the room at dusk, he doesn't try to distract himself with a screen or a drink. He lets it settle. Sometimes, he even nods at it like an old acquaintance. He's learned to treat his emotions like weather, real, powerful, but not permanent. He doesn't need someone else to process with. He doesn't need reassurance that it's okay to feel. He simply feels. And in that quiet practice, he's discovered something he never learned in his younger years. You don't need to be rescued from your emotions. You just need to be present with them. This isn't detachment. It's intimacy with the self. And the more he practices it, the more resilient he becomes, not in a hardened way, but in the way a tree is resilient, deeply rooted, quietly flexible, and still standing after the storm passes. The joy of not being on. He remembers when connection felt like a job. He had to be funny, attentive, supportive, emotionally aware, a good listener, an initiator, a protector, a provider, a man who could do all those things without ever appearing tired, But the truthish was tired, not just physically but existentially, tired of constantly showing up as a version of himself that made others feel safe and seen, even when he didn't feel that way himself. Now, living alone, there is no audience. He doesn't have to bring good energy to the room. He doesn't have to pretend to be okay. He doesn't have to smile on days when smiling feels like labor. He can be flat, or quiet, or messy, or still, and there's no interpretation required. He just is. There's no expectation to perform, no emotional housekeeping to do, and in that absence of pressure, something profound emerges. He meets himself, not the curated version, not the good partner version, the real one. And that version of him? The one who sits on the couch at 3 p.m. reading poetry in sweatpants, the one who takes long showers and talks to himself in the mirror that man is enough. When you no longer feel obligated to be something, you finally get to feel everything. There is no applause, no validation, just a quiet internal exhale that says, "This is who I am when no one's watching." And he's not so bad. The joy of leaving and returning without explanation. For years, freedom had invisible strings. He could leave the house, yes, but not without checking in. Not without giving a reason, estimating a return time, or sending a text if he was running late. It wasn't control, it was just expected. But expectations weigh heavy, even when they're wrapped in love. Now, he grabs his keys, walks out the door. No performance, no plan. Maybe he goes to the bookstore. Maybe he drives for an hour with no music, just the road and the hum of his thoughts. Maybe he sits in a park and watches leaves fall. And when he returns, he steps into a home that doesn't ask questions. There's no tension, no raised eyebrows, no half playful, half serious. "Where have you been?" There's just quiet, familiar, welcome. He walks in the door, places his keys in the bowl, and exhales. Because now, he doesn't leave to escape. He leaves to return. His comings and goings are no longer monitored. They're sacred, an extension of his autonomy. And more importantly, he no longer feels guilty for needing space. Space is his home now, not just physically but emotionally, psychologically, spiritually. In this life, he doesn't need permission to exist on his own terms. He's not disappearing from someone else. He's returning to himself. The joy of listening to his own voice. It started with a whisper, a simple thought spoken out loud, alone in the kitchen. "Don't forget the garlic." Then, a few days later, "Good job, man. That actually turned out all right." He chuckled at himself, not in embarrassment but in recognition, like he'd just bumped into an old friend he hadn't seen in years. His own voice, not the filtered version he used around others, not the diplomatic tone used in arguments, not the cheerful deflection at dinner parties, just his voice, natural, unrehearsed, unapologetic. He speaks to himself now, not constantly, but often enough that the walls of his home know his rhythm. He reads aloud, sometimes from poetry, sometimes from the back of cereal boxes. He narrates his cooking like he's on a quiet, private cooking show. Sometimes he pauses in front of the mirror and simply says, "Hey, you made it." And he smiles. It's not performative. It's communion with the self. There's a comfort in hearing your own voice fill a space where there is no expectation, no judgment, no reply needed. He's learned something most men never get the chance to discover. The sound of your own voice, unedited, is a form of healing. It's not madness. It's presence. The joy of feeling everything fully. He didn't always allow himself to feel. There was a time when tears were rationed, laughter was measured, joy was quiet, pain was hidden. Because somewhere along the way, he absorbed the message that real men didn't linger in emotion. They moved through it quickly, got over it, powered on. But when you live alone, with no audience, something changes. There's no one watching, no one reacting, and suddenly feelings don't have to be managed. They just happen. Now, he cries at unexpected things. A scene in a film, a memory triggered by a scent, a voicemail from years ago. He doesn't wipe the tears away fast. He lets them fall. Sometimes he doesn't even label them. Was it sadness, relief, gratitude? It doesn't matter. He lets the feeling move through him like music with no lyrics. He laughs out loud, too alone, at a silly joke, a memory, something he misread on a package. And the sunsets? He stands at the window longer now, watches light change, lets his chest rise slowly, as if the color itself was meant for him, because it is, when no one is rushing him, when no one is telling him he's too sensitive or too emotional. He finally feels everything as it comes, as it is. That's not weakness. That's clarity. And what he's discovered is this: to feel fully is not to fall apart, it's to come back together. The joy of no unspoken tension. He doesn't miss the silence that meant something. the heavy kind. The kind where words weren't said but felt anyway. The kind that made him guess what mood she was in, or whether he had said something wrong 2 days ago. He doesn't miss the subtle emotional puzzles. The tone shifts, the eye rolls, the "I'm fine" that clearly wasn't. It's not that she was cruel. It's just that living together meant constantly reading someone else's emotional weather report and bracing for impact. Now, the silence is clean. It's not loaded. It's not suspicious. It's not waiting for him to apologize for something he didn't know he did. It's just quiet. He walks through his home and doesn't have to scan the room, doesn't measure the energy before speaking, doesn't hold his breath. Every breath is his. Every room is honest. The walls aren't filled with ghosts of past arguments. The air isn't thick with unresolved tension. His home isn't a minefield of miscommunication. It's sanctuary. What he's found is not just the absence of conflict, but the presence of peace. And peace, he's learned, doesn't announce itself. It just exists in how freely you exhale, in how relaxed your shoulders stay, in how lightly your soul settles into its space. And perhaps most surprisingly, he didn't know how much that tension was costing him until it was gone. Now he doesn't guess, doesn't overanalyze, doesn't decode. He simply lives, and in that simplicity, he's found something richer than romance, more nourishing than validation, a home that holds no secrets and a life that holds no explanations. The joy of going to bed unapologetically. For most of his life, going to bed was a negotiation. What time should we sleep? Can you turn the lights off? Don't hog the blanket. Are you coming to bed now or later? Even restone of the most basic human needs was something to coordinate, to manage, to share. Now, he sleeps when he's tired, no permission needed, no clock to obey. Sometimes that's 8:30, with the windows open and the rain tapping softly on the glass. Other nights, it's 1 a.m., book still open, soft instrumental music playing somewhere in the background, the room wrapped in stillness. He doesn't argue about thermostats, doesn't worry about which side of the bed is his. He sprawls if he wants, sleeps curled in a ball if he needs to. Some nights he sleeps with socks on. Some nights he doesn't sleep at all but rests anyway, deeply and without guilt. There's no partner waiting up, no pressure to cuddle, no silent expectations. And maybe that sounds lonely to some, but for him, it's freedom. Because bedtime isn't a performance anymore. It's not the tail end of a long list of compromises. It's his moment, his peace, his final exhale after a day of choosing stillness over striving. And when he closes his eyes, there's no tension in his body, no emotional residue in the air, just darkness, just silence, just sleep. The joy of being enough. He used to think love would make him whole, that if he could just find the right person, someone to get him, to admire him, to soften the sharp edges, and only then, he'd feel complete. He chased that feeling through compliments, connection, even codependence. But now, standing barefoot in his kitchen at 7 a.m., hair unbrushed, tea in hand, he realizes something he never quite believed in his younger years. He's enough. Not because someone said so. Not because someone needs him, but because he is. There's no more pressure to prove his worth through productivity. No more hunger for applause. No more seeking validation through someone else's gaze. He's not a puzzle waiting for a missing piece. He's not a half looking for its better half. He is the picture. Full, quiet, ordinary, and beautiful in ways that only solitude reveals. There's a moment most mornings when he catches his reflection disheveled, aging, unfiltered, and he smiles. Not out of vanity, but out of recognition. You're still here, he thinks, and you're doing okay. That's not resignation. That's reverence. Because when a man stops needing to be impressive, he finally gets to be true. The joy of unspoken peace. There's a kind of peace that doesn't need to be named. It lives in the way his body softens when he enters his home, in the quiet ritual of locking the door at night, in the gentle click of the kettle before tea. It's not loud, not dramatic, not something he brags about, but it's there. After years of proving, pleasing, performing, no longer lives under the weight of anyone else's expectations. He no longer wears masks, no longer shapes himself to keep the peace. Because the peace now, it's not conditional. It's his. It hums in the background of his days, in the way he moves slower, chooses less, listens more. It's in the unhurried way he prepares his dinner, in the soft grin he gives to the plant blooming by the window, in the ease of falling asleep without fear of being misunderstood. And the most surprising part? No one notices, but he does. Because true peace doesn't need to be noticed. It just needs to be lived. Some people will never understand. They'll see the empty house, the single chair at the table, the solitary routines, and they'll whisper, he must be lonely. But he knows the truth. He didn't give up on connection. He redefined it. He's connected now to himself, to his breath, to the steady rhythm of a life that no longer demands anything he can't freely give. This isn't isolation, it's sanctuary. And if you've tasted even a drop of that kind of peace, you understand. Leave a quiet comment. Solitude isn't sad, it's sacred. Because sometimes, the loudest kind of healing happens in silence.